Welcome to the Aurora Veritatis channel. Today we are going to explore the fascinating story of one of the most beloved and popular saints, Saint Anthony of Padua, also known as Saint Anthony of Lisbon. Have you ever wondered how a young man born into a noble family in Portugal became the hammer of heretics, doctor of the church, and curiously, the patron saint of marriages? Stay with us until the end of this video and discover astonishing details of the life of this extraordinary saint whose reputation for miracles, wisdom, and compassion has echoed for centuries around the world. The story of Saint Anthony begins in Lisbon, Portugal, around August 15th, 1195. His baptismal name was Fernando Martin de Bulhões, son of Martinho de Bulhões and Teresa Tavira, both from noble families. Fernando grew up in an environment of faith and culture, receiving a meticulous education from childhood. This solid foundation would be crucial for the intellectual and spiritual development that would mark his entire life. From a very early age, Fernando showed a deep inclination towards religious life, accompanied by a brilliant intelligence. At the age of 15, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. He joined the monastery of São Vicente de Fora, beginning his journey in the order of the regular canons of St. Augustine. Shortly thereafter, he transferred to the renowned monastery of Santa Cruz in Coimbra, where he devoted himself intensely to philosophical and theological studies, preparing for the priesthood. He was ordained a priest at the age of 24. However, his heart yearned for an even greater commitment, for a more austere and missionary religious life. It was then that, in 1220, a significant event forever changed his trajectory. The arrival, at the monastery of Santa Cruz, of the remains of 5 Franciscan missionaries martyred in Morocco. The heroic testimony of those friars deeply impressed Fernando, awakening in him the desire to also give everything for the cause of the gospel. Moved by this impulse, Fernando made a radical decision. He left the Augustinian order, joined the newly founded Order of Friars Minor, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, and began to call himself Anthony, in honor of St. Anthony, the Egyptian hermit. His goal was clear. He wanted to be a missionary and preach the gospel in the most difficult and distant lands. Antonio set off for Morocco, but upon arriving there, he fell seriously ill and had to return. However, God had other plans for him. On the way back, a shipwreck in the Mediterranean caused him to land in Sicily, Italy. Recovering from illness, Antonio personally met St. Francis of Assisi, albeit in a simple and discreet manner. It was a significant encounter, which solidified in Antonio the decision to fully live the Franciscan ideal. Antonio was sent to a hermitage in Montepolo, in Romagna, where he dedicated himself to prayer, penance, and humble work. His life seemed to follow a path of silence and seclusion, until in September of 1222, during an ordination in Forlì, Antonio was invited to preach impromptu. To everyone's surprise, he revealed himself to be a prodigious speaker, with a profound knowledge of the scriptures and a touching simplicity. It was the beginning of his mission as a preacher, which would lead him to be called the Hammer of Heretics. From that moment on, St. Anthony traveled through northern Italy and southern France, combating the heresies that threatened the Catholic faith, especially those of the Cathars and Albigensians. His preaching was not merely intellectual, but full of fervor, concrete examples, and miracles that touched the hearts of the people. If you are enjoying this content and want more people to learn about the life and teachings of St. Anthony, leave your like. This way, the channel will be able to evangelize even more hearts. In 1224, Antonio was appointed Master of Theology for the friars in training, on the recommendation of St. Francis of Assisi himself. 3 years later, Antonio was appointed Superior of the Franciscan fraternities in northern Italy. He tirelessly visited the convents under his jurisdiction, founding others and always maintaining close contact with the brothers. However, his heart continued to burn for the proclamation of the gospel. Even with such great responsibility, he never neglected prayer and inner life, showing the balance between study and spirituality that would mark his entire performance. It was in Padua, a city in northern Italy, where Antonio found his permanent home. There, Antonio wrote the famous sermons, treatises to guide his brethren in the preaching of the gospel and in the administration of the sacraments, especially penance and the Eucharist. His writings reveal a brilliant mind, combined with a deeply evangelical heart, always concerned with translating faith into concrete actions of love for others. During Lent of 1231, Antonio conducted a series of sermons that are considered his spiritual testament. In addition to his sermons, Antonio performed countless miracles that strengthened the faith of the people. One of the most famous was the episode in which, to prove the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, he made a mule, after 3 days of fasting, kneel before the consecrated host, ignoring the food offered by a heretic. This miracle led to the conversion of that man, his family, and many of those present. Once Saint Anthony was called to preach in Rimini, but the population was not interested in hearing him. Discouraged, Saint Anthony went to the seashore, and in an act of faith began to preach to the fish. Surprisingly, the fish gathered and, with their heads out of the water, paid attention to Saint Anthony. On another occasion, Saint Anthony was preaching at the cathedral on Easter Sunday, when he remembered that he had been assigned to sing the Hallelujah at the Franciscan convent Mass. The saint was seen simultaneously in both places, which became known as the miracle of bilocation. At the end of his life, Antonio asked to be taken back to Padua. On the way, upon reaching the district of Arcella at the city gates, he exclaimed, "I see my Lord," and serenely surrendered his soul to God. He was only 36 years old, but his life was already a legend. Antonio's reputation for sanctity was so great that, just 11 months after his death, he was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. In 1946, Pope Pius XII proclaimed him a doctor of the Church with the title of Evangelical Doctor, in recognition of the theological and spiritual depth of his teachings. Saint Anthony is also called the Ark of the Covenant, due to his extraordinary knowledge of the Bible and his ability to memorize and interpret the Scriptures. His tomb in the Basilica of Padua has become one of the largest pilgrimage centers in the world. There, thousands of faithful seek his intercession, especially on June 13th, his liturgical feast. A curious fact: when his body was exhumed years after his death, his tongue was incorrupt, a sign of the special gift that God granted him to proclaim the Word. Devotion to Saint Anthony is marked by many popular traditions. One of the most well-known is that of Saint Anthony's bread, which dates back to a miracle in which he resurrected a drowned boy, after the mother promised to donate to the poor the weight of her son in bread. Until today, the blessing and distribution of Saint Anthony's bread are gestures of charity and faith around the world. In Brazil and Portugal, Saint Anthony is affectionately known as the matchmaker's saint. The origin of this tradition is linked to accounts of blessings received by those who sought her intercession to find a good marriage. However, it's worth remembering: true devotion is not in superstitions, but in following her example of charity, humility, and dedication to God and to others. Saint Anthony is also known as the protector of lost causes. A famous episode tells that when his precious book of Psalms was stolen by a novice, he prayed fervently until the young man, regretful, returned the book. For this reason, many turn to him to find lost objects, but above all, to rediscover faith and hope. Besides his role as a preacher and miracle worker, Saint Anthony left a legacy of virtues that continue to inspire believers all over the world. Your humility, your wisdom, your compassion for those most in need, and your courage in defending the truth of the gospel are examples of accessible and concrete holiness. In his images, Saint Anthony often appears holding the baby Jesus or a lily, a symbol of purity. Want to know more about other saints and their inspiring stories? Subscribe now to the Aurora Veritatis channel so you don't miss any content. And now we want to know, which of Saint Anthony's miracles impressed you the most? See you soon, and may Saint Anthony intercede for you and your family.